The valley floor had turned into a killing box, and 38 Navy SEALs knew it. Helmand Province stretched endless and hostile beneath the Afghan sun, dust devils spiraling between compounds where muzzle flashes erupted like Morse code spelling death. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hale pressed himself against sun-baked mud brick, feeling the structure shudder with each RPG impact. His radio crackled with desperate coordination between teams scattered across 300 meters of open ground, pinned down by an enemy force that had materialized from nowhere with the kind of coordination that spoke of weeks of planning. Air support had been promised. Air support was 11 minutes out. His men had maybe 4. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves with tactical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned every attempt at movement into suicide. Hale could see where this ended, had seen it before in other valleys with other teams who waited too long for extraction. The ammunition count was getting whispered between positions now, each number lower than the last, each voice tighter with the understanding that numbers don't lie. 7,000 feet above that chaos, Captain Lyra Valkyrie, Kavak banked her A-10 Thunderbolt through crystalline sky, eyes scanning the horizon where mountains cut jagged silhouettes against blue. The Warthog felt like an extension of her spine after 9 years and 1,400 combat hours, responsive to the smallest input, powerful beyond what its ungainly appearance suggested. Her wingman had aborted 20 minutes prior with hydraulic failure, leaving her alone on a patrol sector that intelligence had classified as routine. The radio call from Bagram changed everything in 7 words. Valkyrie, divert immediate. Troops in contact. She punched coordinates into the system, feeling the aircraft respond as she pushed throttles forward. The mission brief was fragments and urgency, typical for troops in contact calls. Heavy engagement, surrounded position, multiple casualties reported. What made her jaw tighten was the grid coordinates, a valley system she'd studied during intel briefings, a natural fortress that insurgents loved and coalition forces learned to hate. She'd been stateside when the whispers started, the ones that followed her from squadron to squadron like contrails that never dissipated. Female pilot, competent enough but nothing special, assigned to CAS missions because the brass wanted diversity statistics. The comments came wrapped in professional courtesy, delivered with smiles that never reached eyes, expressed in tactical evaluations that praised adequacy while damning with faint approval. Kavak had stopped caring what they thought somewhere over Iraq during her second deployment, when a Marine company credited her gun runs with saving 43 lives. But she still heard the skepticism in every radio call from controllers who'd never worked with her before, that fraction-second hesitation before acknowledging her call sign. The valley appeared ahead, and even from altitude she could read the tactical situation like sheet music. The SEAL position was obvious from the concentrated fire, a defensive cluster being systematically compressed by attackers who'd chosen their ground well. She pushed the nose down, beginning her descent into range, and keyed the radio. Hale's radio operator looked up when the transmission came through, female voice calm against the background chaos. Warhawk 3-1, this is Valkyrie. On station your position. Send traffic. The LT grabbed the handset himself because delegation was a luxury he didn't have with rounds punching through the wall above his head. Valkyrie, Warhawk 3-1 actual. Danger close situation. Troops surrounded grid November Victor 4738. Break. Heavy small arms and RPG, approximately 150 hostiles 3 sides. Need immediate suppression Western Ridge line. There was no hesitation in her response, just professional efficiency. Copy all, Warhawk, marking Western Ridge. Stand by. He wanted to ask about ordnance, about fuel state, about whether one aircraft could possibly deliver what they needed. But men were dying while he talked, so he shut up and trusted the Air Force to do its job. Kavak rolled into attack geometry, eyes tracking the ridge line where muzzle flashes created a constellation of violence. The A-10 wasn't elegant, wasn't fast, wasn't anything the fighter-pilot community considered prestigious. It was a flying tank built around a gun that fired shells the size of milk bottles, designed for one purpose, designed for this. She toggled through weapon systems, selecting the GAU-8 Avenger, feeling familiar anticipation build in her chest. The Warthog's titanium bathtub cockpit could absorb punishment that would shred other aircraft, redundant systems throughout the airframe making it tough to kill. Good thing, because she was about to fly into concentrated ground fire from an enemy that had Stinger missiles and knew how to use them. The first pass would set the tone for everything that followed. She armed the gun, adjusted her dive angle to put maximum suppression on that western ridge, while keeping the SEAL position clear of her danger radius. At 4,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger, and the aircraft shuddered as the Avenger spun to life. That distinctive BRRRT sound rippling across the valley as 30mm rounds tore into earth and flesh at 65 rounds per second. Dust and debris erupted along the ridge line, the earth itself seeming to boil under the impact. She pulled hard, climbing away from the attack run, already planning the second pass as tracers reached up toward her like slow-motion death. Below, the effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Taliban fighters. Kavak's gun run had walked destruction along their primary firing position, the depleted uranium rounds punching through cover that infantry weapons couldn't touch. Men who'd been firing disappeared into pink mist and shattered rock, their positions suddenly untenable. Hale saw the western fire slacken, saw his opportunity, started shouting coordinates for movement even as his teams laid suppressive fire. They moved in bounds, professional and fast, extracting wounded while Kavak circled above like a vengeful angel waiting to strike again. She keyed the radio. Warhawk Valkyrie, Western Ridge suppressed, say position and threat bearing. Hale's voice came back tight with adrenaline and gratitude. Good hits, Valkyrie. We're moving to compound northeast corner, taking fire from building's northern sector, grid November Victor 4741. She acknowledged, already rolling toward the new target, eyes scanning for the squat structures where fresh muzzle flashes flickered. The Taliban were repositioning, trying to maintain the encirclement even as their advantage dissolved. They'd underestimated American persistence, underestimated air power, definitely underestimated the woman now lining up her second gun run with mathematical precision. This pass would be trickier, buildings closer to friendly positions, margin for error measured in meters rather than the comfortable 100-meter buffer doctrine preferred. Kavak checked her sight picture, confirmed the SEAL position on her display, made the mental calculations that separated professional pilots from dead ones. At 3,000 feet she fired again, the Avenger's roar splitting the afternoon as rounds impacted building facades. Mud brick exploded into powder, wooden support beams shattered. Entire wall sections collapsed inward, crushing the fighters who'd thought concrete and clay would protect them. She climbed away through a storm of ground fire, felt impacts along her starboard wing, but the Warthog absorbed them without complaint. Kept flying like getting shot was just part of the job. The SEALs used the suppression to advance again, the noose that had been tightening around them now loosening with each of Kavak's passes. Hale coordinated movement between fire teams, watching his tactical display update as positions shifted. The A-10 had bought them breathing room, but the enemy wasn't broken yet, just disrupted. They'd regroup, adapt, press the attack from new angles. He needed that aircraft overhead for the long haul, needed its gun and its mere presence keeping Taliban heads down. He keyed the radio again. "Valkyrie, what's your fuel state?" Her response came matter-of-fact, no drama, just information. "Warhawk, sufficient for extended support. I'm not leaving." Those 4 words settled something in Hale's chest, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing someone competent has your back. He'd worked with air support from every branch, every aircraft type, and the quality varied wildly. Some pilots treated CAS like a video game. Others took it personally when you asked them to risk their aircraft in close support. This woman sounded like she'd sooner crash into the valley than abandon them, which was either insanity or the highest form of professionalism. Probably both. The SEALs consolidated at the compound northeast corner, establishing hasty defensive positions while corpsmen worked on casualties. 4 wounded, 2 serious, everyone else running on adrenaline and ammunition that wouldn't last forever. The Taliban had pulled back from immediate contact, but Hale could see movement in surrounding buildings, watched through his optic as fighters repositioned for another assault. Kavak orbited above, maintaining visual contact with the friendly position while scanning the surrounding terrain for threats. Her fuel gauge showed she'd burned through reserves faster than optimal, the gun runs and aggressive maneuvering drinking fuel, but she'd meant what she'd told that LT. These men needed air support, would die without it, so she'd stay until the tank ran dry and then figure out how to stay longer. The A-10 community had a saying, when you're out of fuel, you're out of options. She'd find more options. Below her the valley was transforming, the tactical situation shifting from total disaster toward something survivable. Not safe, but survivable. That was progress. She spotted movement along the eastern approach, vehicles kicking up dust trails as they wound through narrow paths toward the SEAL position. She zoomed her targeting pod, counted 4 technical trucks, machine guns mounted in the beds, moving fast. Reinforcements for the Taliban, another 20 or 30 fighters about to tilt the balance back toward catastrophe. She didn't wait for clearance, just rolled in hot and selected rockets this time. The LAU-131 pods under her wings, each carrying 7 Hydra rockets. At 2,000 feet she fired, watching the weapons streak downward, trailing smoke. The lead technical disappeared in an orange fireball, the second vehicle swerving into a ditch as its driver instinctively flinched from the explosion. Her remaining rockets bracketed the road, creating a barrier of fire and shrapnel that stopped the convoy cold. Hale watched the distant explosions through his binoculars, felt something like awe mixing with relief. That female pilot was reading the battlefield like she'd written it herself, anticipating threats before they materialized, turning every pass into exactly the violence his team needed. The radio chatter among his men reflected changing attitudes, the initial skepticism when they'd heard a woman pilot responding shifting toward respect. Combat was the ultimate meritocracy, and she was delivering merit by the ton. He considered what to say, some acknowledgement beyond tactical thanks, but she was already talking. Warhawk, convoy destroyed eastern approach, scanning for additional threats. Professional, focused, already looking 3 moves ahead while his team was still processing the last one. The afternoon stretched into evening, shadows lengthening across the valley as the sun descended toward the western peaks. Kavak had been on station for 90 minutes, well beyond normal patrol duration, her fuel state dropping into the range where math became unavoidable. She'd need to leave soon, head for the tanker, let another aircraft take over. But the replacement was delayed, mechanical issues back at Bagram, and the SEALs were still in contact even if the intensity had decreased. The Taliban were probing now, testing defensive positions, looking for weaknesses they could exploit the moment air support vanished. She checked fuel again, did the calculations. 20 more minutes, maybe 25 if she climbed to altitude and conserved everything. Then hard choices. But sometimes hard choices made themselves. Her radar warning receiver screamed, threat indicator lighting up with the signature she'd been dreading. Surface-to-air missile launch, heat seeker tracking her exhaust, coming fast from the southern valley wall. She punched flares, felt the aircraft shudder as decoy charges blazed white-hot behind her, rolled hard into a defensive spiral while maintaining visual contact with the missile. It tracked the first flare cluster, detonated 200 meters behind her starboard wing, concussion wave rocking the Warthog even at that distance. She kept the spiral going, gaining altitude while scanning for the launch site, knowing there'd be a second missile if they had them. There was. The RWR screamed again, another launch, this operator smarter or luckier, waiting until she'd expended flares before firing. She had more flares, always more flares, but now her fuel state was critical because defensive maneuvering burned what she didn't have. The second missile corkscrewed up toward her, infrared seeker locked on despite the flares, and Kavak made a decision that would either save her or kill her. She rolled inverted, dove straight at the missile, closing speed until the seeker couldn't compensate, then snapped hard left as the weapon passed 50 meters from her canopy. It couldn't turn tight enough to follow, self-destructed in a flash of orange fury that she barely saw because she was already diving toward the launch site, gun armed, rage and adrenaline making her movements sharp and certain. At 1,500 feet she fired, walked the Avenger's Fury across the rocky outcrop where smoke still lingered from the launcher. 30-millimeter rounds shattered stone and equipment, silenced the missile team permanently. She climbed away breathing hard, checking instruments with hands that were steady despite the adrenaline dump. Fuel was now in the red, critically low, but the SEALs were still surrounded and the sun was setting. Hale's voice came over the radio, tight with concern he couldn't quite hide. "Valkyrie, we saw those missiles. You need to egress." She almost laughed because egress meant leaving them to whatever came next, and she hadn't stayed this long to quit when it got personal. Negative, Warhawk. Still mission capable, which was true in the technical sense, though her fuel state made it a temporary truth. She'd stay until she couldn't and deal with the consequences when that moment arrived. The Taliban used the failing light to press another assault, small arms fire intensifying from multiple directions as they tried to overwhelm the SEAL position through sheer volume. Kavak couldn't make gun runs in the growing darkness without risking hitting friendlies. Her targeting system's good but not perfect in these conditions. So she did something the A-10 was never designed for but excelled at anyway. She went low, 300 feet above the valley floor, slow enough that her engines became a roar that echoed off the mountains, and she just flew circles around the SEAL position. Didn't fire, didn't need to, because the psychological impact of a close air support aircraft orbiting that low was more powerful than any weapon. The Taliban fighters heard that sound, knew what it meant, knew that death could come from above at any second, and their assault faltered. Hale watched the Warthog circle overhead, so close he could see panel lines on the fuselage, and understood what she was doing, showing the enemy that air support wasn't leaving, that any attack would be met with immediate and devastating response, buying his team time with nothing but presence and the threat of violence. It was brilliant and crazy and probably against every safety protocol in the Air Force manual. His radio operator was grinning despite the situation. "That pilot is absolutely insane." Hale nodded, eyes still tracking the aircraft as it completed another orbit. "Best kind of insane." The attack had stalled completely now, Taliban fighters withdrawing to covered positions, unwilling to expose themselves with that aircraft overhead. Kavak had bought them another reprieve, though everyone knew it couldn't last. Her low fuel warning was steady now, not a caution anymore but a crisis. She had maybe 10 minutes of flight time before she'd be gliding, and the nearest friendly airfield was 23 minutes away even if she left immediately. The tanker was trying to reposition. The replacement A-10 was wheels up but still 15 minutes out, and the SEALs were still in danger. Math didn't care about determination. Physics wouldn't negotiate. She climbed back to altitude, every foot of elevation potential energy she could trade for distance when the engines quit. Keyed the radio one more time. "Warhawk Valkyrie, my replacement is inbound, callsign Hammer 36. I have to egress for fuel." She paused, wanted to say more, settled for truth. "You're getting another Warthog. Same ammunition, same guns, you'll be covered." Hale acknowledged, professional and brief, though part of him wanted to ask her to stay anyway, because trust isn't easily transferred. The relief aircraft checked in moments later, male voice crisp and ready, and Kavak executed the handoff with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 100 times. Position updates, threat summary, friendly locations, all the critical information compressed into 2 minutes of radio traffic. Then she turned northeast, pointing her scarred Warthog toward the tanker, fuel gauge bouncing on empty, and focused on the simple problem of staying airborne long enough to reach the refueling track. The valley fell behind her, evening shadows swallowing the compounds and ridgelines where men still fought for survival. She'd done everything possible, delivered every ounce of violence her aircraft could provide, and now her war was with fuel and distance and the growing darkness that made navigation harder. The tanker appeared on her radar, big and slow and beautiful, a KC-135 orbiting at 20,000 feet with fuel to spare. She climbed to meet it, coaxed her dying warthog upward on fumes and momentum, established contact with the boom operator who'd been tracking her situation and was ready. The connection was smooth, practiced coordination between professionals, and fuel began flowing into her tanks with a relief she'd never quite get used to. The boom operator's voice came through. "Valkyrie, boom, we were monitoring your frequency. Hell of a performance down there." She didn't know how to respond to that, settled for simple acknowledgement. "Boom, Valkyrie, just another day at the office." But it wasn't, and they both knew it. Refueled and mission complete, she should have returned to Bagram, filed her after-action report, grabbed dinner and sleep. Instead, she requested another station time in the valley, monitoring the SEAL extraction that was now underway with proper support, full package of air assets and QRF elements. Hammer 3-6 was doing solid work, maintaining the suppression she'd started, but Kavek stayed overhead anyway, watching from altitude as helicopters descended in darkness to pull the SEALs out. The extraction went smoothly, professionals executing a well-rehearsed evolution, and 40 minutes later the valley was empty of American forces. The Taliban could have it back, could claim whatever victory they wanted, because the SEALs were safe and heading home, and that's what mattered. She finally turned for Bagram at midnight, tired in the way that comes from sustained adrenaline followed by the crash. The landing was routine, taxi to parking, shutdown checklist executed with muscle memory. The crew chief who met her aircraft did a walk around in silence, then looked up at her as she climbed down. "Ma'am, you've got 17 holes in this bird. 3 of them look like 23 millimeter. She followed his pointing finger, saw the damage she'd been too busy to notice during flight, felt retrospective fear that she hadn't allowed herself to feel while it mattered. The Warthog had taken the hits and kept flying, lived up to its reputation for toughness, protected her while she'd protected those men on the ground. She ran her hand along a scarred wing panel. "She'll fly again," the crew chief nodded. "This is an A-10, ma'am. We could patch her with duct tape and chewing gum and she'd fly." The debrief was waiting, intelligence officers and her squadron commander, all wanting details while memory was fresh. She walked them through it chronologically, clinical in her description of gun runs and threat responses, but she could see something in their expressions that hadn't been there before. Respect, maybe, or recognition. The footage from her targeting pod would tell most of the story, black and white imagery of violence delivered with precision. But what it couldn't show was the decision-making, the risk assessment. The choice to stay when leaving was logical. Her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, a veteran of 3 combat deployments and someone who'd seen everything, let her finish before speaking. "The SEALs are already writing up their report. They credit you with saving the entire team." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Word spread through Bagram with the speed that military communities specialized in, and by breakfast the next morning Kavek found her reception changed. Pilots who'd previously offered professional courtesy now sought her out, asked questions about the mission, treated her insights like they mattered. The change was subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens when competence becomes undeniable. She'd proven something, not through argument or advocacy but through performance under pressure, the only currency that truly mattered in combat aviation. Her wingman from the previous day's aborted patrol found her in the squadron-ready room. "Heard you got busy after I left." She smiled, tired but genuine. "Target-rich environment, you'll get yours." He nodded, paused, then spoke the thing that clearly had been bothering him. "I've been an ass about female pilots, I'm sorry." She appreciated the directness. "Then don't be an ass going forward, that's how you apologize." The SEALs arrived at her squadron 3 days later, Lieutenant Commander Hale leading a delegation that looked uncomfortable in the Air Force environment. Kavak was in flight planning when they found her, maps spread across a table as she prepped for a routine patrol. Hale introduced himself, though she recognized his voice from the radio, and his handshake was firm and sincere. "Captain Kovac, I wanted to thank you personally. My team, we all wanted to thank you." She felt awkward with gratitude, preferred the simplicity of mission objectives and tactical problems. "Just doing the job, sir." But Hale shook his head. "No, you went beyond. You stayed when you shouldn't have, took risks that weren't required, put yourself between us and some very bad outcomes. That's not job, that's—" He paused, searching for the word. "That's the kind of support that saves lives, so thank you." The other SEALs echoed the sentiment, a chorus of thanks from men who understood the difference between adequate and exceptional, who'd been on both ends of air support and knew what they'd received was special. One of them, a quiet senior chief with eyes that had seen too much, stepped forward. "Ma'am, in the teams we have a saying, brothers keep brothers alive. You're not a SEAL, but you're our sister now. That means something." She felt emotion rise in her throat, unexpected and powerful, because respect from these men carried weight that no evaluation report could match. They judged her in the crucible, found her worthy, offered acceptance that didn't depend on gender or background or anything except performance when it counted. After they left, she sat alone in the ready room, processing the encounter, understanding that something had shifted not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. The skepticism she'd carried for years, the internalized doubt that came from constant questions about her capabilities, had been burned away by 3 hours over a valley where nothing mattered except results. She'd proven to herself what she'd always believed but sometimes questioned, that competence transcended categories, that her gender was irrelevant compared to her ability to deliver violence on target when American lives depended on it. The Valkyrie call sign had started as a joke, Norse mythology filtered through fighter pilot culture, women who chose the slain. Now it felt earned, appropriate, a name that carried meaning. Her remaining deployment passed in a blur of missions, some routine, some intense, all executed with the confidence that came from knowing she belonged. Other pilots started requesting her as their CAS support, ground units asked for her by name, and the reputation spread beyond Bagram to the wider theater. The woman who'd stayed overhead when her fuel state demanded departure, who'd flown through missiles to protect troops in contact, whose gun runs were surgical and devastating in equal measure. Awards came with the reputation, medals and commendations that looked impressive on paper, but meant less than the nods from fellow pilots or the thanks from ground troops who'd survived because of her work. But the mission that defined her wasn't the Valley Rescue, impressive though it was. It came 6 weeks later, a Taliban stronghold that intelligence had been tracking for months, a compound where high-value targets gathered to plan operations. The strike package was elaborate, multiple aircraft types, careful timing, the kind of mission that gets planned at levels far above squadron. Kovac was assigned as supporting CAS, backup in case the primary strike aircraft encountered problems. The mission launched at dawn, aircraft assembling over Afghanistan like pieces of a deadly puzzle, and she orbited at altitude watching the strike unfold with professional interest. The F-16s went in first, precision-guided munitions turning buildings into rubble with efficiency that she appreciated but couldn't match with her more brutal platform. Then everything went wrong simultaneously, the way combat operations sometimes did despite planning. The F-16s had destroyed the primary target but missed a secondary compound where armed fighters poured out like disturbed hornets, and a special operations team tasked with battle damage assessment suddenly found themselves in heavy contact. The strike package was already departing, fuel states critical, ordnance expended, and the special operations team was pinned down 2 clicks from their extraction point. The mission commander made the call that Kovac had been waiting for without knowing it. "Valkyrie, cleared hot all targets of opportunity vicinity November Victor 5219. Friendly positions marked on your display. Keep them alive until we can get extraction in." She acknowledged, already rolling into her attack run, feeling the familiar focus that came when everything else disappeared except target and trigger. The gun runs were close, danger close by any definition, her 30mm rounds impacting within 50 meters of friendly positions. But the special operations team trusted her, confirmed each pass, and she delivered devastation with the precision that separated professionals from everyone else. Building facades collapsed under her fire, vehicles exploded when her rounds found fuel tanks, fighting positions that had seemed secure became death traps. The Taliban forces tried to press their assault, but Kavak maintained a continuous presence, orbiting and striking, creating a barrier of violence that couldn't be crossed. Extraction helicopters arrived 23 minutes later, guided in by her talk-on, and the special operations team extracted without additional casualties. The after-action review called it a textbook example of close air support, the kind of mission that gets used in training to show how it's supposed to work. But for Kavak, it was validation of a different kind, confirmation that the valley hadn't been luck or adrenaline but skill that could be repeated. Her aircraft had absorbed more battle damage, her fuel state had again dropped to critical, and she'd again chosen to stay rather than preserve safety margins. The pattern was clear, the reputation cemented. Valkyrie didn't abandon troops in contact, didn't prioritize her own safety over mission success, delivered violence when needed and presence when violence wasn't enough. Fighter pilots respected skill, but they worshipped reliability, and she'd become both. The deployment ended in autumn, the Warthog squadron rotating back to the States with the satisfaction of work well done. Kavak processed through the standard decompression, the mandatory counseling and medical checks, the adjustment period that every combat veteran experienced differently. She found herself restless stateside, missing the clarity of combat where problems had solutions that could be solved with ordnance and determination. Garrison life felt trivial, the daily routine of training and evaluations and peacetime bureaucracy seeming meaningless compared to the stakes she'd grown accustomed to. But she adapted, threw herself into instructing new pilots, sharing lessons learned in the only classroom that truly mattered. Her reputation had preceded her return, and now young pilots sought her out specifically, wanted to learn from Valkyrie, hear the stories that had already become legend in the A-10 community. She was careful with the teaching, focused on fundamentals rather than heroics, emphasized decision-making over drama. But she couldn't avoid the questions about the valley, about staying overhead despite fuel state, about flying through missiles. Her answer was always the same, simple and honest. You stay because they need you. Everything else is just math and math can be solved, risk can be managed. But abandoning troops in contact isn't an option, so you find ways to make the math work. The young pilots listened like scripture was being delivered, and maybe it was, the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving situations that kill others. Promotion came, then command, her career trajectory accelerating with the momentum that competence and combat performance created. She found herself leading the same squadron she'd once been questioned in, setting the culture, demanding excellence while demonstrating it. The A-10 community was small, tight-knit, everyone knew everyone, and her leadership style reflected the lessons she'd learned in that valley. Support your people, trust their competence, don't ask them to do anything you wouldn't, and never abandon them when circumstances get hard. Simple principles that created cohesive units, squadrons that performed beyond expectations, because everyone knew their leader would back them absolutely. Years passed, deployments blurred together, Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and places that never made the news but where American air power worked quietly to keep ugliness contained. Kavak accumulated flight hours that put her in the top percentile of A-10 pilots ever, her experience encompassing the full range of close air support missions. She'd supported every ground unit type, worked with allies from a dozen nations, delivered ordnance in every terrain, and weather condition the Warthog could operate in. The aircraft itself was aging, politicians periodically trying to retire it, but pilots like Kavak kept demonstrating why it remained irreplaceable. No other platform could do what the A-10 did: loiter low and slow, absorb punishment, deliver precise violence in close proximity to friendlies. The awards accumulated too: distinguished flying crosses and air medals, commendations from ground units and foreign militaries, recognition from a community that didn't give it lightly. But the award that mattered most came from an unexpected source: a ceremony at Naval Special Warfare Command where Lieutenant Commander Hale, now a full commander, presented her with a SEAL Trident. Not the actual warfare device, she wasn't qualified and never would be, but an honorary version mounted on wood with an inscription: to Valkyrie, who kept faith when it mattered most. Brothers keep brothers alive, and you're our sister forever. She accepted it with emotion she didn't try to hide, because these men had seen her at her best and worst, had trusted her with their lives, and offered acceptance that transcended service rivalries. But legacy isn't built on individual missions, however spectacular, and Kavak understood that her lasting impact would be measured differently. The young female pilots who now entered the A-10 community didn't face the skepticism she had, or faced less of it, because she'd proven that competence was gender-neutral. The questions about physical strength in combat aviation had been answered by her performance, the doubts about decision-making under pressure silenced by her record. She hadn't set out to be a pioneer, hadn't wanted the responsibility of representation, but history had placed her in that role and she delivered. Now other women followed, some good, some exceptional, all benefiting from paths cleared by pilots who'd proven themselves when proof was required. Her final deployment came at 20 years of service, one last rotation to Afghanistan as squadron commander, leading from the front like she always had. The war had changed, become fragmented and complex, but the fundamental mission remained. American troops needed close air support. The A-10 provided it better than anything else, and she led her pilots with the confidence of absolute mastery. They flew daily missions across the country, supporting operations that ranged from routine to desperate, and Kavak made a point of taking the hardest missions herself. Not because she didn't trust her pilots, but because leadership meant sharing the risk, demonstrating that rank didn't exempt you from danger. The mission that would be her last came without warning or drama, just another day of troops in contact needing support. An Army patrol had hit an IED complex, casualties and disabled vehicles, surrounded by Taliban fighters who'd planned the ambush well. Kavak responded with her wingman, two warthogs diving into a tactical situation that was deteriorating rapidly. The gun runs were precise, the coordination flawless, suppression delivered exactly where needed. She was lining up her fourth pass when the golden BB found her, that one-in-a-million round that hit the right system at the wrong time. Hydraulic failure, catastrophic and immediate, the controls going dead in her hands as fluid sprayed from ruptured lines. The warthog started rolling right, emergency procedures running through her mind, even as she fought the aircraft with what control remained. Ejection was the obvious answer, the safe choice: punch out and let the aircraft crash while she floated down under canopy. But she was still over the patrol position. Her flight path would carry the warthog directly into friendly positions if she didn't alter it, and ejection meant abandoning control absolutely. So she stayed with it, fought the dying aircraft toward clear terrain, used emergency systems and raw strength to maintain some semblance of control. Her wingman was calling on the radio, demanding status, offering help that didn't exist. She managed 5 words: Valkyrie staying with it, crash landing, which was optimistic terminology for what was coming, controlled flight into terrain being the polite phrase for organized disaster. The warthog hit hard, belly landing in open desert that turned out to be less open than it appeared. The aircraft tore apart on impact, titanium bathtub protecting her from the worst of it, but physics applying forces that body armor couldn't defeat. She felt ribs crack, tasted blood, experienced the surreal sensation of violent motion followed by sudden stillness. then smoke and fuel smells, and the urgent need to evacuate before something sparked. She unstrapped with hands that shook, dropped from the wreckage that had protected her, stumbled away from the aircraft that had been her partner for 2 decades. The explosion came 30 seconds later, fuel igniting with a roar that she felt as much as heard, the Warthog consumed by fire that sent black smoke spiraling into afternoon sky. The rescue came fast, her wingman directing forces to her position, medical evacuation landing within 15 minutes. The Army patrol she'd been supporting provided security, soldiers establishing a perimeter around the crash site with dedication that spoke to their understanding of what she'd done for them. The patrol leader, a young lieutenant who looked about 19, found her sitting against a rock while corpsmen worked on her injuries. "Ma'am, you flew right over us before you went down. You steered away from our position." She nodded, because explaining seemed too difficult with broken ribs and concussion. He understood anyway. "Thank you. You saved us twice." The medevac helicopter arrived before she could respond. Professional chaos as they loaded her aboard, started the medical interventions that would continue through multiple levels of care. The injuries ended her flying career, the medical retirement board using terms like chronic pain and reduced pulmonary function to describe what combat had cost her. She fought the decision initially, then accepted it with grace she'd learned from watching others go through the same process. 20 years of service, 1,600 combat hours, missions that ranged from routine to legendary, and a reputation that would outlive her active duty career. Not a bad run by any measure, though leaving was harder than she'd anticipated. The retirement ceremony was well attended. Fellow pilots and ground troops she'd supported, commanders she'd served under and alongside. The speeches talked about valor and dedication, used words like heroic and inspirational, painted a picture of service that felt simultaneously accurate and inadequate. But the moment that crystallized everything came after the ceremony, when a young female captain approached her privately. Fresh out of training, newly assigned to her first A-10 squadron, nervous and eager in equal measure. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, when I was in high school deciding whether to join, I read about you, about the Valley mission. That's why I'm here." Kavek felt the weight of that statement, the responsibility of representation she'd never sought but couldn't escape. Then don't waste it. Be so good they can't ignore you, so competent that nothing else matters. And when troops need you, stay overhead. Everything else is details. The young captain nodded, starry-eyed and determined, carrying forward a legacy that hadn't finished being written. Civilian life was adjustment, the transition every veteran faces when military structure disappears. Kavak found work as a defense contractor, advising on close air support tactics, her experience too valuable to waste. She consulted on aircraft design, weapons systems, training programs, translating battlefield lessons into improvements that future pilots would benefit from. The work was satisfying in an abstract way, but nothing matched the immediacy of combat, the clarity of purpose when lives depended on decisions measured in seconds. She stayed connected to the A-10 community, attended reunions and symposiums, watched new generations of pilots master the Warthog and make it their own. The recognition continued, awards and speaking invitations, requests for interviews about her career and the missions that had defined it. She accepted some, declined others, wary of becoming a caricature of herself, the female pilot who'd proven women could fight. The story was more complex than that simple narrative, layered with institutional resistance and personal determination, the quiet support of commanders who'd seen her potential and the loud opposition of those who hadn't. But what mattered ultimately was the simplest truth, that competence transcends demographics, that performance under pressure reveals character more clearly than any evaluation, that keeping faith with troops in contact was the highest calling in combat aviation. She'd lived those principles, proven them repeatedly, and left a legacy that couldn't be erased. The Warthog itself was finally retired years later, the aircraft that had defined her career obsolete in an era of stealth and precision. though veterans like Kovac mourned its passing. She attended the decommissioning ceremony, watched as static displays replaced operational aircraft, saw younger pilots shake their heads at the obsolete technology their predecessors had flown into combat. But she remembered what that obsolete technology had accomplished: the lives saved, the missions completed, the reputation earned one gun run at a time. The A-10 hadn't been elegant or fast or stealthy. It had been tough and reliable and devastating when needed, which described its pilots too. She'd been privileged to fly it, honored to fight in it, grateful to have survived it. Lieutenant Commander Hale found her at the ceremony, older now with gray threading his hair, but still carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd survived too much to doubt his own competence. They'd stayed in touch over the years, the bond forged in that valley transcending the normal boundaries between services. He looked at the static display, the warthog frozen in time, and spoke quietly. "That aircraft saved my life. You saved my life. My team went home because you stayed overhead." She nodded because denial would insult the truth. "I did my job, you'd have done the same." He considered that, then smiled. "Maybe, but you did it, and that's what counts. The world doesn't give points for hypotheticals." They stood together watching the ceremony conclude, two veterans contemplating the aircraft that had shaped their understanding of combat, sacrifice, and the bonds forged under fire. The crowd dispersed, families and civilians taking photos, younger pilots looking at the warthog with academic interest rather than lived experience. Kovac felt the generational shift. The way history becomes story becomes myth, the details lost but the essence preserved. She'd been part of something larger than individual missions, larger than one pilot's career, part of the evolution of military aviation and the slow expansion of who gets to serve and how they're judged. That felt like legacy enough. Years later, her story was still told in ready rooms, passed down from experienced pilots to newcomers learning the culture. The details varied in each retelling, the Valley mission growing more dramatic or more technical depending on the teller, but the core remained. Valkyrie had stayed overhead when leaving was logical, had delivered violence with precision when troops needed it, had absorbed damage and kept flying because that's what the mission required. For female pilots entering the community, the story carried additional weight, evidence that the barriers they faced could be overcome through competence and determination. For all pilots, it was a reminder that service sometimes demanded more than duty required, that excellence meant making hard choices, that the highest calling was keeping faith with those who trusted you with their lives. Lyra Kovac died at 68, peacefully and surrounded by family, her service complete but not forgotten. The obituaries ran in military publications and mainstream media, summarizing a career that had broken barriers and established standards. But the real memorial came in the ready rooms where her call sign still appeared on heritage boards, in the lessons taught about close air support done right, in the quiet moments when pilots preparing for combat remembered what excellence looked like and tried to match it. She'd flown the Warthog when others doubted she could, had protected troops when the situation seemed hopeless, had demonstrated that competence transcended every category people tried to impose. In the end, she'd been exactly what the military needed: a pilot who cared more about mission success than personal recognition, who understood that service meant sacrifice, who stayed overhead when everything logical said to leave. The legacy of Valkyrie, written in contrails and gun runs, and the lives of soldiers who went home because one pilot refused to abandon them. That story would outlive the aircraft and the pilot both, passed down as long as there were warriors who understood what it meant to keep faith under fire.